Welcome back to the program. We are joined today by Marco Carnelos, who has been a diplomat for more than 3 decades in Italy's foreign service. He's also worked as an advisor as well as a special envoy for 3 prime ministers, including Silvio Berlusconi, and he's been an ambassador to Iraq, a special envoy for the Syria and Middle East peace process. I'm not sure if I left anything out.
Well, I also, first of all, good afternoon, Glenn, and to you and the audience. I've also been advisor of Romano Prodi as Prime Minister, former President of the European Commission as well.
Yeah, I met him once at a panel in Kazakhstan. A great fellow, though. Brody, that
Yeah.
is. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Well, given that you have all this experience as a diplomat in the Middle East, I really wanted to ask, I guess maybe start with a wider question, given how much the region and as well as the world is changing. Given that you're a former ambassador as well as have been a special envoy to the region, what do you watch in the region in terms of the developments which are most important?
Well, Glenn, let me put it in this way. A lot of people, experts, scholars, opinion makers, like to see how much the Middle East has changed. And if there's a constant in the Middle East history, is usually that any prediction about the Middle East in due course turn out to be not correct. And so the region is a huge source of disappointment for everybody venturing into try to predict which could be the events in the region. Let's say that definitely we are in a period in which the main actors in the region are not the peoples who are living in the region. Let me say that the main actors in the region at the moment are the Israelis, who are not Arabs, the Turks, who are not Arab, to a certain extent, the Iranians, who are not Arab, plus the United States and someone else. A few years ago, let's take as a reference point, for example, if you take the concept of broader Middle East, and so we embrace the big region that was called Greater Middle East from Morocco to Afghanistan. The impression a few years ago was that the so-called Pax Americana in the region was in retreat. The impression was that other players were taking place and making the headlines in the region. It could be Turkey, it could be Israel, it could be Iran, and so on, or some Emirates in the Gulf. The war, who erupted in 2023, is giving back a role to the United States. The main question we should ask, if this role of the United States, this renewed role of the United States, is going to stay or is going to be a temporary event. We know that the United States at large is not a nation that sometimes is consistent in its policies. Sometimes the political discourse in the United States change very quickly. And so when you see the determination of one administration in the region, not necessarily is going to be confirmed by the following determination. We had a moment, for example, that Obama, after the Cairo speech, gave in 2009, gave the impression a new approach of the United States in the region. And then a few later, we had the impression that the Americans, always under Obama administration, were not keen to engage again or to engage more, just to go back in the region because ISIS from Syria started to occupy vast areas of Iraq, threatening more than one state in the region. Now we have Trump, the first Trump that said, I'm not going to be involved in a region because it's a huge waste of resources. There was a famous tweet by Donald Trump, the first Donald Trump in the first administration, said 7 trillions of dollars spent, 1 million of deaths. By the way, it was the American president that said the American engagement in the Middle East that caused directly and indirectly 1 million deaths. The millions and millions of refugees to obtain nothing. That was for Trump in the first administration. Now we have Trump on the line with a peace plan for Gaza, which has the ambition to become the first step of a major peace plan for the region. Let's say that for the time being, I don't see the region change a lot. There are the potentiality for a change, but this will depend first if Trump will be consistent in his plan, most of all, above all, if he will be a fair player. And I don't know yet if he's going to be a fair player. And it depends also how much the other two big nations, Russia and China, will play in the region, if they want to play a role, if they will allow the Americans to play a success in the region. And last but not least, what the Iranians are going to do, especially if the Americans and the Israelis will try the change of regime they are talking about since decades.
Well, a lot of the problems we have now, they do seem to derive from former, well, if not, well, let's call them mistakes. But what are the main experiences you have with, well, let's go for a broader Western policy towards the region, although, the Americans and Europeans have, of course, always had some different approaches. But what do you see being, because you just described this desire to sometimes engage with the region, sometimes to transform it, other times to pull back. What do you think are the main limitations as well as, I guess, mistakes which we've committed there over the, well, especially during your time in the Middle East? What you observed?
Glenn, if we should start a discussion about the mistakes in the Middle East, we could spend at least 2 weeks talking 24 hours a day. Let's say that the mistake started, of course, roughly 100 years ago as a consequence of the First World War and the collapse of Ottoman Empire and let's say, the colonialist policies disguised under the mandates that were given through UK and France. And most of the problems today in Middle East are related to mistakes made by immediately after the end of First World War or during the First World War. I'm talking about the secret agreement between France and UK, the so-called Sykes-Picot Agreement. I'm talking about the Balfour Declaration on November the 2nd, 1917, that so the His Majesty government being favorable to the creation of a national home for Jews in the Holy Land. Of course, everybody read the first part of the Balfour Declaration, the availability of UK to consider positively the Jewish home in Palestine under British mandate in a few years, but nobody read carefully the second part of the Balfour Declaration that say that this should have not cause any prejudice to the people already living in the region. The fact is that this prejudice took place, and this is part of the history we are still living today. As I said, the mistakes are many. We have no time to count all of them. As to my, let's say, experience, it was probably the attempt by the United States, together with Israel, to impose a Pax Americana in the region, or a Pax Israelo-Americana in the region, that didn't take into account the hard realities in the region. The fact that many Arabs, many Turks, many Iranians were not so keen to have a Pax Israelo-Americana in the region because it was not a fair peace. It was a peace to full advantage of Israel. And today, more or less, we are in the same situation. What has changed is the dynamic between United States and Europe vis-a-vis the Middle East. I remember very well that in the early 2000s, after September 11, between 2002 and 2003, there was the famous quartet for the Middle East. Um, uh, let's say a contact group made by US, Russia, UN, and European Union. At the time, the dynamic of that quartet was mainly a dynamic between US and European Union. And in fact, the major accomplishment that came out from the quartet at the time, I'm talking about 2002, 2003, was the roadmap for the Israeli-Palestinian peace. It was a very comprehensive plan, highly detailed, much more detailed than the Trump plan, the 20 points that plan issue and made the other nation endorse on October 13 in Cairo, in Sharm el-Sheikh, sorry. Well, that document, it was a long document with a lot of specific clause, was the result of a very tough negotiation between US and European Union. Today, the piece we are watching, the 20 points Trump's plan, is basically an American decision. They decided with Israel, period. Europeans had no role at all, and they were simply asked to go to Sharm el-Sheikh and to endorse the plan. Even with, let me say, a very humiliating treatment in front of the cameras. I don't know if you noticed that Trump was it was a one-man show by Donald Trump, and there was a very humiliating situation inflicted to Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, with Trump asking, where is the UK? And then he turned and he saw Starmer. Okay, you are here. Come on. And Starmer went to the podium, expecting that he was asked to say a few words. And no, Trump, okay, you are here. Well, go back now. So it's a really humiliating situation, but it was not the first we have seen any other humiliating situation when all the Europeans were gathered in the Oval Office, all sitting around the Trump desk, or Ursula von der Leyen that was summoned in Scotland in Trump golf course. So Europe today is not anymore the European Union today is not anymore the European Union that was in the early 2000s. And we can see the results. So the mistakes today, maybe in the past were shared mistakes, maybe the results of American and European interaction. Today, if the mistakes are mistake by act by the United States, a mistake by omissions by the European. They simply do not dare to challenge the American decision on the Middle East and on many other topics. Iraq was a huge mistake. We all know that. Even the Americans realized now that it was a mistake. But of course, one of the architects of that mistake was Tony Blair. The mistake was so big that the services of Tony Blair were asked again to, I don't know what, to create a new situation in Gaza. So it depends how the Trump plan will develop, if will develop, and how. Mistakes that will be made. There is still a big mistake, is a mistake in the approach, but maybe something I could explain at length later.
This is part of a wider global development, it seems. That is the huge power shift between the Europeans and Americans. Again, in the early 2000s, there was more parity. The Europeans opposed the US more firmly in terms of what they believed to be a mistake with Iraq. But these days, of course, the power relationships, as you suggested, with the Europeans lining up in front of his desk, or the more humiliating, even maybe possibly more humiliating display in Egypt. But during your days, though, as the Italian ambassador to Iraq, what was your main experience with with developing the region? Again, Italy being a medium-sized country, but also a very important EU member state.
My experience in Iraq was, in a certain sense, helped by the fact that Italy was the second largest military contributor to the stabilization mission in Iraq after the United States. I'm talking about the period between 2015, 2017. In terms of training mission for the Iraqi special force in Baghdad, for the Kurdish forces in Kurdistan, for the protection extended to the Mosul Dam that was at risk of collapsing. That was a very, very critical moment because we remember very well the Americans were really, really concerned at the time that the Mosul Dam could collapse. And the estimates made by a very specialized, the American Corps of Engineer, that the prediction, the projections of what could be, they expect that if the dam collapsed at the time, there could be 60 meters of water in Mosul and 6 meters of water 2 days later in Baghdad. So it would be a catastrophic event with an estimated number of 1 million deaths. So at the time, there were only a few companies in the world that could save the dam. One was a German company, the other was a French company, and the last one was an Italian one. The American selected in a sense that they believed that at the time the company more qualified for the works was an Italian one. So the Italian company was selected, but Italy, of course, deployed 700 soldiers around the dam because it was very close to the front line. The most interesting experience for me at the time was that the disconnection that there was between what was going on in Washington and with the American diplomats and military on the ground. In Washington, they seem to be in a different reality. They have to use the usual caveat that they have. We don't talk with these people. We don't talk with these other people. When on the ground, the American rely very much on us to talk with people they usually do not talk with. I'm talking about the pro-Iran Shia militias in Baghdad and elsewhere. I'm talking about certain Shia figure. And so at the time, there was a very, very interesting diplomatic activity in which we, the Italians, talked and with this group. And there are some Europeans that, to a certain extent, were shocked by the fact that people like me used to talk with people that were in the official terrorist list. But the Americans knew perfectly that and encouraged me to do it. And in a certain occasion, I facilitated the meeting between American and Shias in order to have a better understanding of the situation and to put it on the ground in a way that had to be an element of stabilization. And to a certain extent, it worked. Of course, Iraq is a big disappointment because the stabilization of the country has not brought the rebuilding of the country. Iraq has a huge governance problem and has, unfortunately, still an high level of corruption. And there are crossing veto between many different groups. So yes, ISIS was defeated. The stabilization was introduced. But if I have to say that we have the governance that we need to have in order to have Iraq as a factor of stability and not anymore a factor of instability, this is something I'm not confident to say at the moment. So, which is the message? That many times the Americans on the ground, being diplomats or military, have much more realistic and much more common sense of the people who are leading them from Washington. Was true at the time, and I still believe is true today. What can we build upon on that? Honestly, I don't know. I'm out of the games now.
But the way you see it, though, the Europeans now playing a less independent role from the United States, do you see any wider consequences? I'm thinking, well, partly, for example, about this the EU3 who or the European three who imposed these snapback sanctions on Iran, for example. What I hear from Tehran is, well, there's no more point talking to the Europeans. This is the only reason why we listen to them to begin with. But again, not just that they severed an important connection and political agreement, but then also because they often interpret now the Europeans as essentially subordinating their decision making to the Americans. I mean, it's not that different from often what you hear from Moscow, which is, there's no point to talk to the Europeans. Why not just go talk to Washington, who kind of excessively, I guess, represent Europe these days?
Well, Europeans is a typical case of the famous motto, there's no limit to the worst. In the sense that, let's say we can have three stages of European utility. We had, as I said before, a very important European role in the early 2000s, both in the Middle East peace process, as I already mentioned, the roadmap. There could be a very important role in trying to stop the biggest American mistake in Middle East made in 2003 with the war in Iraq. It failed, but at least some Europeans, they make very clear their disagreement. I'm talking about, of course, France and Germany at the time. Then there's the second stage where the European has become irrelevant. This is the period that we have been living in the last years, where the Europeans have not been able to do anything in order to moderate both the American and Israeli in the war in Gaza. And then we are to the third and most dangerous stage, where the Europeans not only are irrelevant, not only are idle and they do not have a role at all, but they are now in a negative role in order that they cause problems. And the snapback sanctions decision you just mentioned is the typical case of what they call the Murphy Law of the Middle East. I hope you are familiar with the famous Murphy Law. If something can go wrong, it will do it. In the case of the European, if the European can go something wrong in the Middle East, be sure they will do it. And of course, they did it, because in this tense moment, the last thing we had necessity of was to have an increased tension with Iran again. Because at the end of the day, probably Europeans are short on memories, but the nuclear deal with Iran was destroyed by the Americans, not by the Iranians. That's the first point to take into account with the Trump decision to renege the JCPOA. Then the Biden administration tried to revive the JCPOA, except they tried to do it differently when they tried to get out with a different agreement, and the Iranians had no incentive, because the agreement was working probably, everybody was implementing it, except for the Americans. Even during the Obama administration period, they didn't implement it in the full spirit of the deal. But let's put this issue aside. And now, instead of punishing who is trying to destroy the deal, that were the Americans, they are punishing the country who was respecting the deal with the snapback sanctions. So I honestly don't see any logical reason for the Europeans to do what they did. Maybe they wanted to have a leverage with Iran because the window to have the snapback sanction was closing. The deadline was, I believe, it expected to be tomorrow was the deadline, probably October 21st. They acted this, they used this clause, probably on the American demand, because the American, legally speaking, being out of the deal, they couldn't promote the snapback sanction. So they asked the Europeans, and they immediately said yes. And now the situation to go back to a nuclear deal with Iran are less and less positive, unfortunately. So ultimately, at the end of the day, Europeans are becoming like the so-called Mida touch, King Mida, that used to touch everything he used to touch was transformed in gold. In the case of European, I'm very, very sorry to say that whatever they touch, it doesn't turn in gold. It doesn't turn in something that is much less pleasant. It's brown and it stings. And everybody can understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah, no, it's unfortunate to see, yeah, this the direction for Europe. But sometimes one get the impression that the problem is partly a leadership issue as well. We don't really have the same quality leaders we used to have. I mean, I know not everyone has to like every politician, but one has to still recognize that political leaders like Chirac or Schröder, Berlusconi, they were quite, uh, well, let's say iconic, or they were giants of their time. So to some extent, I was just wondering from your experience, or how important was personal relationships in the regional diplomacy?
Well, you mentioned some important names. Of course, if you consider for a moment, for example, the parable that France leadership had. We had the Mitterrand, we had Chirac, and then one after the other had a series of French leaders. There was a huge disappointment, starting from Sarkozy, moving to Hollande, and now with Macron. This is really something that nobody expected from a country with a huge tradition like France. But we could say the same with Germany. Let's say after Angela Merkel, what we had? Schröder. I think history will be remembered in German history as the man that was told that the Nord Stream gas pipeline was going to be destroyed. He was told in a press conference with the American president, and he didn't say a word. So he will be remembered probably by this heroic attitude in front of the destruction of one of the major energy infrastructure of the country. And now we have something that it's uh, it's dangerous every time he open his mouth, and we are talking about Frederick Merz. So the two most important countries of Europe, France and Germany, have a huge leadership deficit. They had a huge leadership deficit for the last, let's say, 5, 10 years. This is the same for United Kingdom. It's even more shocking. Okay, UK is not anymore a member of the European Union, but do we want to say that we had great leaders like Margaret Thatcher? Well, no. We had Theresa May. We had Boris Johnson. We had a lady that lasted 30 days. I even forgot the name. Then we have another guy that was there 1 year and a half for the first British Prime Minister that was not an Anglo-Saxon origin. And now we have another disaster in the making that is called Keir Starmer. And how can we expect to have Europe as a relevant actor in an international stage with such kind of leadership? Not to mention what we have in the European Commission with Ursula von der Leyen on the European Council. Do we want to match these people with what Jacques Delors or Romano Prodi were able to do during their mandates? Come on. It's a very sad page of European history. And honestly, I don't even know if we already touched the bottom or we are digging once we touch the bottom. And it's true. Nobody is engaging anymore the Europeans, either for the Russian Ukrainian file, either for the Middle East file. And I also believe that even China is not interested anymore in order to have any kind of big political dialogue with the European Union. Why they should waste their time with the European Union when they can spare time and speak directly with the United States that more or less are dictating the European policy even towards China. It's a matter to be practical. So if I was a Chinese leader, I shouldn't waste a lot of time with European. Yes, European Union is still a big market for China, but we also know that China is diversifying its trade market, usually in Southeast Asia and in the rest of the world. Maybe in due course, in not a big period of time, Europe will become irrelevant for China, even from the trade point of view.
With China, though, I mean, its presence in the Middle East is also growing. This has primarily been economic, but we also saw it translated into some issues such as the efforts to improve relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But of course, we also have Russia, I guess, re-entering the Middle East in a big way through Syria. Of course, I think the Syrian, I guess, submission for the Russians created a lot of difficult problems for them in other parts of the region. So I get the impression they're not that unhappy with that period necessarily being over, but their ambitions in the region, though, in terms of economic and diplomatic, is still not over. But I guess primarily the Chinese would have the economic clout in the region. But how do you see the entry of these two Eurasian giants changing the wider region?
Glenn, on this point, I'm a little bit cautious. Let me explain why. I don't see that the political role of China and Russia in the Middle East matches their economic potentiality. I mean, these two actors are more important, more relevant from an economic point of view than the political one. And let me explain why. Yes, China accomplished a big success in starting a diplomatic dialogue between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Maybe this dialogue is continuing. Maybe there's something we do not know, and underneath, the two countries are going on and are progressing, but we have no elements to say that. What is China very relevant? Is very relevant in the fact that its trade relationship with the region is improving a lot. Inside the different formats that China has been able to launch together with Russia and other countries. I'm talking about the BRICS Plus, but with a significant number of Middle Eastern players that have been added to the group. Is significant with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Is significant because China is starting to trade oil with the region and settle the payment in renminbi. That is something that in itself is a possible weakening of the role of the dollar in global trade, something that in Washington is not perceived positively. But there are big cooperation projects with Egypt around the Suez Canal, with the Emirates, and so on. But I do not see China play in the Middle East the role that a country of the size of China deserves. And this is very strange because the Middle East represents one of the main supplier of energy for China. So if I was a Chinese leadership, I would focus much more on the region. For the time being, the impression is that Middle East is essentially an American-Israeli show. Well, sometimes we have some formats that are coming out with Turkey that was more or less admitted in this possible transitional authority that will take place in Gaza. I think the devil is in the details, and the details are very poor. But what we know that especially in the Middle East, the devil is not in the details. The devil swims in the details. And so just to say that there's a long way that has to be taken in order to clarify. Also because, as I think you carefully mentioned in a post yesterday, the ceasefire was established, but during the ceasefire, I think the Israeli already killed 100 Palestinians, more or less. It doesn't sound a very effective ceasefire to my ears, but maybe I could be wrong. We know that ceasefire needs adjustments, but here it's more than an adjustment. The same for Russia. Russia is the role of Russia in the Middle East is very important from the OPEC plus format, where the interaction between Russia and Saudi Arabia has been able to fix the price of oil for the last 10, 15 years. And this has been a significant asset because essentially they preempted the American attempt to have the oil price to collapse in order to create a problem to Russia and to someone else. Yes, Moscow lack in Syria. Actually, no, from the military point of view, they never left Syria because the port of Tartus and Hemin air base, the Russian never left these two spots. Now there was a visit by the former chief of Al Qaeda to Russia, just to mention one more time how much serious all these countries are when they say they are struggling against terrorism. And so even Russia have all the interest to have the Middle East under control or to have a significant presence in the region. And to all the effort that Russia and China are doing for their so-called Eurasian integration, of course, the Middle East is a crucial region in order as a possible economic corridor. Iran is a crucial partner for both regions. And we are in a situation where apparently neither Russia, neither China seems to do enough in order to help Iran to stop or to preempt or to prevent American-Israeli plans to have a change of regime in Tehran. And honestly, I don't get it, this policy. Maybe I'm missing, remove the maybe. For sure, I'm missing some elements. I'm missing some information. I'm missing essential details. But I can give to myself a logical explanation for how reluctant Moscow and Beijing have been so far in engaging more actively in the region, where to a certain extent I explained the many reasons why this region is important for them as a single nation, but also for the major project of Eurasian integration they are carrying out.
Yeah, no, it's well, I heard this been asked before as well. Um, However, my last question though is just in terms of, well, you already alluded to it in terms of the ceasefire not going great in Gaza, well, to say it the least, but this wider conflict and the way it escalated over the past 2 years into a genocide, how do you see this conflict now having changed the basics of the Middle East? Because there's been some major changes. I'm not sure what kind of consequences it will have, but for example, the um, the Israelis bombing American allies in the region, and I guess the growing discontent among the populations from Egypt to Jordan. I'm not sure if the Turkish behavior is more posturing than having any substance, but do you see any fundamental ways that the last 2 years have changed the region?
Well, let me say that why it escalates? Well, it escalates because Israel was exposed to a kind of attack that it was never exposed before. We have to go back to the Yom Kippur War in 1973 to see a so big number of casualties. At the time were mainly military casualties in the Sinai Peninsula, this time where the third of the casualty were civilians. And definitely it was a shock for Israel. And in the day immediately after, I had the occasion to meet some Israeli counterparts. They anticipated to me that this time we are going to react in a way that you have never seen before. Or to be more precise, we have been watching before Israel having the so-called mowing the lawn policy in terms of carpet bombing Gaza. But there were limited periods for weeks where just part of Gaza or Khan Yunis or Rafah had been bombed. This time, this mowing the lawn went on for 2 years, and with devastating destruction. Essentially, they erased completely Gaza. And notwithstanding all that, Hamas is not defeated. Is hugely weakened. They lost a lot of men, but is not defeated. And in the logic of these movements in the Middle East, that they consider themselves the David against the Israeli Goliath, the simple fact they were not defeated, in their perception of the reality, it turns now they won. Because the forces employed were so disproportionate. We are talking about a few men hiding in tunnels, that they have some individual rifles, some rocket launchers. And on the other side, there's the most effective army in the world with the best airplane and any kind of military equipment. And so if you go and read again through the 20 points plan, it's evident that, of course, there's never a mention of the Palestinian state. They only talk about a political horizon. It's very, very vague. But Hamas is not defeated, and this is a fact. And it's going to reverberate a lot in the streets, not in the courts or in the palace in the Middle East, but in the street among the people. But this is the first point. The second consequence is that the legitimization of Israel has been huge. In the last, let's say, since the last effort to carry on an Israeli-Palestinian peace, and I'm talking about the attempt made by John Kerry in 2014, who failed because of Israel mainly. There was a sort of everybody forgot about the Middle East. Everybody forgot about the Palestinians. The Europeans became more pro and pro-Israelis. And when Israel in 2018 moved the capital to Jerusalem, there was the famous march in Gaza for Jerusalem. The Israeli deployed their snipers along the hills on the border on Gaza. There were peaceful manifestation moving towards the fence, symbolic manifestation, and hundreds of people were killed by the Palestinian snipers. Not a single voice came out from the United States and Europe to denounce what happened. A shameful silence by the leadership. This time, the magnitude of killings up to a point that now there's a legitimate case to investigate Israeli practices as a possible genocide. It is the International Court of Justice that has to say that. There are some preliminary opinions that would may authorize to think that there's some substance in the accusation of genocide, and the delegitimization that Israel has in the American streets among the American youth and European streets among European youth and not only youth, it's huge. Israel today, unfortunately, is a pariah state, and we have to go back to the 60s after the 6 Days War to find out a similar situation. And I don't know how the Israelis will get out from that. They have still a very powerful media shaping apparatus. They have a very powerful narrative shaping apparatus. They still have a significant support in Germany and other European capitals and in the United States. But in order to recover to such a situation, the sooner the Israelis get rid of Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, and Smotrich, the better. And this is not going to be enough, because the main problem is that even the Israelis' opposition agrees on the Israeli policies in Gaza. And if the polls are correct, the majority of Israel people as well. So we are not talking about 2-3 extremists in a government. We are talking in a situation where the problem is not only the Israeli government, but to a certain extent, the aged mind of Israeli public opinion. And I don't know if there's a possibility to recover from that situation. And if we do not recover from that situation, a fair, just, and lasting peace with the Palestinians will be more and more difficult. Also because on the other side of the Palestinian, also due to what happened in the last 2 years, the will to have an understanding of a permanent peace with Israeli might have decreased significantly.
Just actually one final thing though is yeah, given that from the Israeli perspective, they see Iran as essentially being the head of the snake in terms of their main opposition or enemies in the region. And as we know, back in June, Israel attacked Iran. At that time, of course, the United States joined in on the war on the side of Israel. And from Europe, we have people like Chancellor Merz praising the Israelis for doing the dirty work for us. I'm not sure why that was required, bombing the nuclear facilities, why this would be good for Europe, but you see another attack coming because well, the Americans seem to have begun to concentrate some assets, military assets in the regions. They have pulled away from some of the more vulnerable bases in Iraq, as you're aware. Do you think that there might be another war coming?
Okay. First of all, it very much depends how successful Trump plan will be. Now, Trump is still enjoying the success for the ceasefire. But actually, the Trump plan, the ambition is to be something more than a ceasefire. But we already see that the ceasefire is weak, also because technically speaking, even the Israelis informally recognize. I mean, I'm talking about the serious Israeli, the one who are in the security sector, the professional, with whom sometimes I have the chance to speak. They recognize that considering the situation in Gaza, the level of destruction, the destruction also of Hamas chain of command, recovering all the bodies could be something very difficult. Definitely, those who drafted the 72 hours deadline to recover all the dead bodies, they had no idea what they are talking about. Or I suspect they put such a stringent, such a short deadline in order to have the pretext to continue the war. Because my experience of the ceasefire in the region is binding only for the Palestinians, never for the Israelis. And if the arbiter are the United States, of course, we should not have surprised what the Americans are going to say about. I was quite impressed, on the other hand, by the interview that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner gave together to 60 Minutes on CBS, where they openly said that Israel was going out of control. I'm talking about the bombing in Qatar, and we had to rein in Israel to a certain extent. And by the way, we are talking about two personalities that in the American establishment could consider someone very, very close to the Israeli lobby. And the fact that they went on TV with that kind of interview, it means that that was a very, very clear signal that was sent to Netanyahu and to his extremist ministers. And so that's the first point. The second one is that it's time to stop talking about Iran as an existential threat for Israel. Once again, if you speak with serious Israelis who are in the military and security sector, they know perfectly that Iran is both is a scarecrow used for political purpose. The biggest existential threat for Israel is inside Israel. And they recognize that. They will never say publicly, of course, but in private, they recognize that. And so this is something that Israel should look into itself in order to come to terms with that. Yes, Iran had their own policy. Definitely, to many Israeli, it might appear as a dangerous policy. But if they want me to believe that Iran has the capability to be an existential threat for Israel, I doubt it. The country is under sanctions since 40 years. Yes, to a certain extent, he has been able to escape sanctions. But Israel proves how much Iran can be penetrated by their assets, their intelligence. So Iran doesn't give me the impression to be such dangerous country that should scare everybody in the region. So the possibility of a strike, if Trump plan will go into the quicksands, as I believe it will happen, because it's too vague, and once the celebration is over and someone has to work seriously on the details of the plan, recognizes also the Palestinian grievances, well, it will probably be blocked. And someone like Trump will need to put the attention somewhere else. And there are two chances here. One, a deal on Ukraine, I hope so, or the other one is going to be another attack to Iran. And I don't want to venture in what could happen with China, but the signals on China are there are too many mixed signals on China that I prefer not to venture on this topic this time, maybe another time.
I remember the last time we spoke, you said that you're very reluctant to make predictions for the reason you said as well, that it's most likely predictions will go wrong. So, well,
I prefer to offer perspectives.
perspectives.
Everybody is making prediction, but prediction usually turn out to be wrong. Perspective help you to understand the context. And if you provide perspective, definitely you do not go into the surprises you get into when your prediction turn untrue.
I agree. So, thank you so much for sharing your insights. And I hope you can come back and talk to us again some other time.
Thank you, Glenn. With pleasure.